So looking back at our unit circle again, now we're going to be talking about radians. So remember that if you start right here, you are currently at 0 radians. I know that halfway across the circle is going to be pi radians, which means halfway to the halfway, so a quarter of the way. This would have been pi half radians. And then if I went half a circle and then another quarter, this would have been 3 pi radians. And if you finished your 2 halves, this would have been 2 pi radians. So right now we're going to actually be doing our radians. So we're being asked to use the unit circle. So I need to draw a unit circle. So here is my XY axis and here is my circle. If it's a unit circle, then I currently only know 4 coordinate points. This is the coordinate point 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. So here's my unit circle. My 6 trig functions. So those are my 6 trig functions. Now I need to find specifically when my theta was pi. So here is my initial side. I know that all the way around the circle was 2 pi, but I don't want all the way around the circle. I just wanted pi. So pi is halfway, so pi would have been over here. So my travel from here to here would have been a distance of pi. So this is the coordinate point that I will be using. Remember, this is an XY coordinate point. In the other video, we also learned that x was always going to be our cosine and y was always going to be our sine. So if I'm looking for sine, I'm looking for the y coordinate, which happens to be 0. If this were a fraction, this would have been the fraction 0 over 1. So if I came over here to reciprocal it, I would have gotten 1 over 0, and anything divided by 0 is going to be undefined. Cosine, I know, is always my x, and I found out my x to be negative 1. If this were a fraction, it would have been the fraction negative 1 over 1. So if I were to reciprocal that for secant, I would have gotten 1 over negative 1, which simplifies down to negative 1. Tangent is y divided by x, and I know my y is always my sine, and my x is always my cosine. My sine was 0. My cosine was negative 1. If I simplify this fraction, I get 0. But if I were to reciprocal this fraction for cotangent, I would have gotten a negative 1 over 0, which gives me undefined. So we're being asked to use the unit circle, so we need to draw a unit circle so we could actually use it. I need to do 6 trig functions, so my 6 trig functions. And now I need to find out where theta is negative pi halves. So here's always our starting side. Negative meant I need to go backwards, so I need to go this way. Pi halves, I remember that half of the circle was pi. So pi halves would have been half of that half, which would have taken me right here. So here's my negative pi halves. So I'm trying to find it of this coordinate point right here. Now I remember this is an xy coordinate point, but I also remember that the x was always my cosine and the y was always my sine. So if my sine is always the y, I just found my y to be negative 1. If this were a fraction, it would have been the fraction negative 1 over 1. So if you were to reciprocal that, it would have been 1 over negative 1, which simplifies to negative 1. Cosine is always my x. My x is a 0. If this were a fraction, it would have been the fraction 0 over 1. So if I were to reciprocal that, it would have been 1 over 0, which would have given me undefined. Tangent is always y divided by x, which is the same as sine divided by cosine. My sine was a negative 1. My cosine was 0. Negative 1 divided by 0 is undefined. You're not allowed to have a 0 in the denominator. If I took this fraction and reciprocaled it, it would have been 0 over negative 1. 0 divided by negative 1 is 0. So here are my 6 trig functions.